Welcome to Eye for Iran. There's a lot to cover this week. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, says Iran must seriously improve cooperation with UN inspectors. Meantime, you have Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, delivering another defiant speech, praising the 1979 hostage crisis as a day of pride. Iranian lawmakers are calling for legal action against President Trump, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi. And the United States is calling the death of an Iranian man who burned Khamenei's photo suspicious, suggesting regime involvement. Meanwhile, Tehran is reportedly pushing its proxy militias in Iraq to shift from armed resistance to political engagement, a strategic recalibration with far-reaching implications. To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by Alex Vatanka, the director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute, Jay Solomon, the author of the Iran Wars, and Shahram Kholdi, a historian specializing in Iran's domestic politics, ideology, and regional strategy.
Now, Iraq may become, in a very odd way, in such desperate times for the Islamic Republic, the Achilles heel of the Trump administration.
The Iranians study us. They study our politics probably more than we study it ourselves. They're going to understand where this is headed, and they're not going to be inclined to make any more great concessions.
Iran is barely making it in terms of its daily needs as a country, and by the way, falling daily behind everybody else in the Middle East.
I'm Negar Mojtahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Thanks for being
Hello.
here.
Thank you for having us.
Wonderful. Yeah, great. Happy to have you all here. So let's start off with Iraq. There are reports suggesting that Tehran is now asking these armed militias, these armed Shia factions in Iraq to switch over from armed militia to the political realm of things, trading weapons essentially for influence. Jay Solomon, we'll start with you. You wrote the book, The Iran Wars, fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend. And you talk a lot about the different proxies, and you specifically touched on Iraq and how Iran was a big winner after the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein, and how they really built their influence. So what do you make of this alleged move?
Well, Dick Cheney died this week, and his biggest error, I think, was thinking that Iraq would sort of move away from Iran rather than towards it. So I just mentioned that. But I think, Iran has been severely weakened in the wake of the 12-day war. And whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Palestinian territories, the collapse of the Assad regime, they're on their back heel. So what I see happening is just efforts by them to maintain their proxies and to sort of stay below the radar screen, but rebuild. And I think, given these threats coming from the United States, these are efforts to sort of keep their proxies in place, but sort of at a lower level, particularly when the U.S., as you were mentioning earlier, has been threatening the Iraqi regime about demobilizing these militias. So I'm kind of skeptical they'll really move solely into politics and away from being armed. But I think it all kind of fits into this era we're in right now, where the Iranians are on their back foot, but clearly still committed to rebuilding their proxy network, and this is one step in that direction.
And what does that say about the Iranian regime, Alex? I mean, we saw that with Hezbollah, right, where they've got their political faction and they've got military. Same with Hamas as well.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree pretty much with everything Jay just said, Negar. And I think, if we could just go back a few days ago with the latest speech from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as Jay just pointed out, it seems like the regime is trying to rebuild. It hasn't made a decision to take the 12-day war and take that to be a lesson to change course. That does not seem to be the case. They're not changing course. Yes, they don't want to confront the United States because, here's Donald Trump that has repeatedly surprised them over his first and second term. I mean, going back to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, that was a big surprise. The taking out the nuclear facilities back during the June war probably shouldn't have been a surprise because he had said he would do it. But again, Tehran seemed to have been surprised by that. So they're not going to be surprised again if they can help it. It seems to me to be the case. But bottom line is they want to rebuild as much as they can. within limits. I mean, they probably have a much better sense of their limitations today than they did before this summer. But again, they don't want to have that open fight, if you will, on the Iraqi, certainly not the Iraqi soil, because I think the Iranians feel that they can remain influential in Iraq, even if they make some symbolic gestures in terms of some of these so-called PMF groups, the Reshape groups, putting away their arms, putting on political suits instead of uniforms, as long as they stay close to Iran and are willing to sort of help Iran, then that could be just enough for the Iranians.
And Shahram, you're a historian. What do you make of this recent news that the U.S. is allegedly warning Iraq against these armed factions and interference? I mean, what does that say to you? Is something brewing?
I think so. And I think when we look at the history of post 2003 Iraq, it is basically, in my opinion, a long and tried story of too many initiatives that were, first and foremost, as Jay mentioned, half-baked or predicated on very flawed presumptions. Not to mention far-fetched and totally unrealistic. What threw the wrench into the whole scheme after having Brenner and then bringing in Petraeus was that ISIS turned up, and it became a force, and it became a non-state transnational force that could tap into the oil resources, that could sustain itself. And it took President Trump and the final escalation that took place under President Trump to deal with it. The problem, in my opinion, is that each of the actors here, if we put it in the history of international relations, for the long durée of 25 years, have been all stuck at once in a prisoner's dilemma. That is, they are the prisoner of each other's nuanced, I would say, propaganda campaign against one another, as well as a security dilemma. Every time that President Trump in his first term, or even President Obama in his first term, wanted to kind of recalibrate American presence in the United States, it somewhat backfired, and they were forced to escalate in order to destroy whatever that was impeding the situation. And to be fair to Trump, he inherited a lot of wrong-headed Obama policies, but that's a different story. What I think President Trump is right now stuck with is that he wants to cater to the concerns of MAGA. I think it was today that Marjorie Taylor Greene declared that he's going to run for president of the United States. I mean, these people are isolationists par excellence. And back to Jay's mentioning the late Vice President Dick Cheney, I mean, the pendulum has swung radically from one end to the other. Yeah. But Trump knows that if he creates the kind of vacuum that exists in Iraq, the Islamic Republic has learned its lessons from Hezbollah and the failure of Hezbollah. So the way they are going to reshape Iraq, in my opinion, in view of their 25-year-long experience, is to try to refashion Iraq in a different form, in a presentable form, that would guarantee the regime's influence. That is, most likely they will try to, in the name of disarming the militia, they are going to have them integrated into the regular armed forces instead of having something like IRGC or Hezbollah being armed in Lebanon or IRGC being influential in Iran, and in a way recreate the Islamic Republic light version in Iraq, which
2.0.
Which 2.0, which can be, of course, dealt with if Trump and his administration would be a little bit proactive
if they would
about
allow it too, right? They might actually allow it. It might work because what do you think about that, Jay? If they dress it up and make it pretty, like Shahram's saying, would that work with the Trump administration in terms because optics is so important? I mean, not just for Donald Trump, but for all politicians.
I think it probably would. What's amazing is if you're the Iranian government looking at our Americans' politics right now, just, a few months after this crippling loss in the 12-day war, you're loving it. As Dr. Kholdi said, you've got kind of an isolationist wing of MAGA really seeming to grab the dialogue. It maybe didn't get that much attention, but President Trump pulled the man who was supposed to be his assistant secretary of state, a guy named Joel Rayburn. There's probably because he was seen as a neoconservative, and literally there was quickly. But he was literally, if there was no one in the U.S. administration who was more focused and understood the proxy network and was more committed to pushing it back. So you look at with Trump pulling him. You see the election of Zohran Mamdani in New York. If you're the Iranians, you're seeing a political environment arising in the United States that's very good for your foreign policy. And if you can sort of wait it out a few more years and dress things up, I don't think Trump is really that excited about getting into much more of a military confrontation in Iran, or in Iraq. So I think the Islamic Republic is looking at a very good political atmosphere emerging in the United States, and they probably can dress things up and sort of wait it out.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially because, a lot of, I think, Iranian Americans were very hopeful, I guess, some of them, that they felt that Trump was going to be very tough on Iran. And some would say that he was, I mean, in terms of his involvement in the 12-day war. What do you think about that, Alex?
About whether Trump has been tough on Iran?
Well, just in general, in terms of the strategy here that's coming out of Iran and the impact that would have on U.S. politics and vice versa. Would that make, because we've seen so many different versions of Trump, if you will, during this administration when it comes to his Iran policy, would that help to, make him more tough, less tough? Like what would we see emerging and the impact it could have on U.S. politics? Because we are seeing it already.
Right. I mean, the bottom line is the Trump administration has been more ready, if you will, to use force to, put Iran back in the defensive. But fundamentally, the Trump administration, again, going back to the first Trump administration and the second one, has been willing to use force, sanctions, talk a big game, but hasn't made a decision in terms of fundamentally what it wants the Islamic Republic to do. And that, I think, is the sort of the missing part here. Do you want regime change? Well, then there's a whole pathway where you can go and bring about or try and bring about regime change. But that is not what the Trump administration is about. Do you want something else, which seems to be basically what they want, which is for Iran, if you will, to behave, to sort of go back in its box, not to interfere, to put a cap on the range of its missiles, to give up enrichment. These are things that, on a transactional way, you might see some traction, that's exactly what the Iranians are hoping that they can bring the conversation back to. Just listen to the last set of speeches of Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. What is he saying? He's saying, yeah, we'll talk about the nature of our nuclear program, but we're not going to talk about the missiles. We're not talking about anything else. So if you're Trump, how do you force the Iranian regime to talk beyond just an issue of enrichment? Because frankly, I mean, the enrichment issue isn't at the heart of the U.S.-Iran conflict. And that's a fundamental decision the president has to make. We just heard Shahram and Jay talk about the politics in this country. And we're not even talking about what's going on south of the United States with, the latest developments with Venezuela and so on. In other words, the United States has a lot on its plate. This is a president that wants to be a domestic president, and yet he's finding himself being all over the place. And again,
that's the irony.
That's the irony. So it really, going back to something we all talked about earlier, Negar, United States, if anything, you need to put a lot of political capital if you want to achieve something as big as, turning Iran. If you want to deal with this regime, turn this regime in a different direction. It requires a lot of political capital. Whatever wonderful thing the United States Air Force is able to do in terms of dropping bombs alone is not going to solve this. It requires political capital, requires patience. And I don't see the Trump administration right now being committed to that kind of long game when it comes to Iran.
So are they being indifferent in some ways?
I wouldn't say they're indifferent. They're sort of hoping that the regime will come to its senses, that this is a regime that now I've really humiliated you. Now I've really shown you what I can do. You want to rebuild? I can destroy it again. How often are we going to do this? Hoping that the regime will get the lesson and change course. And there's Ali Khamenei coming back and saying, we're not going to change course. So, maybe the Trump administration has to wait if it's going to happen in the next 3 years for the demise of Ali Khamenei, because as long as Ali Khamenei is there, right now, given his rhetoric, I don't know if the Trump administration can expect that man to, if you will, change course.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make there, Alex, because when Trump was in the Knesset in Israel and he made a speech, he kept saying over and over again, very confidently, he's like, the Iranians want to make a deal. They want to stay in power. They don't want it. So
Right.
but then you've got the Khamenei factor here. And I know, Shahram, you'd like to step in. Please give us more.
Yeah, actually, what Jay said, and especially Alex's follow-up, just triggered this thought in me right now that Trump, in a very odd way, is following the gunboat diplomacy of the late 19th century British Prime Minister Palmerston, mixed with Bismarck's blood and iron diplomacy, and they were all an extension of a militaristic diplomacy, whilst Trump is presenting himself in a very odd way, like President Theodore Roosevelt, who really dawned the beginning of the American empire by using the force of the U.S. Navy and U.S. prowess to advance U.S. diplomacy. And at the same time, President Roosevelt was the man who actually brokered a lot of, he brokered peace between the Russians and the Japanese, and he was like a peacemaker. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. But then Trump is massively hostage to his own domestic rhetoric, as Alex said. And what I cannot really make sense of is that such an alert administration, because when we compare it with Biden and the way he really botched the Afghanistan situation, it seems that Trump is very alert that something like Afghanistan would not take place in Iraq, that all of a sudden they would pull out and then there would be a new Shia state, albeit with a secular kind of appearance in power. Basically, a Shia version of the Assad regime, but with less anti-Israeli rhetoric. So if that is going to be the case, such an alert, but at the same time militaristically proactive administration, when it is fighting a tariff war with us in Canada, with the Chinese, I mean, like, for instance, it was discussed that, the media outlets said that, President Xi and President Trump did not discuss anything about Iran. I honestly find it hard to believe that they did not discuss, especially in view of Wang Yi's calling the Islamic Republic counterpart Iraqi yesterday or the day before yesterday, telling him that the Iranians should stop being so intransigent with respect to the nuclear negotiations, as Alex alluded to, with respect to the enrichment and all sorts of things. So if we triangulate all of these together, in a way, President Trump has to break through somewhere. And we have been waiting for that breakthrough, and it is not happening. And actually, I would like to hear both Jay. I would like to hear what Jay and Alex have as to what it is that is arresting Trump's development towards a breakthrough in his dealings with the Islamic Republic.
What do you think, Jay? Let's start with you and then Alex.
I just think internally, his whole policy development seems to be fractured. Like I was mentioning, this gentleman, Joel Rayburn, was supposed to basically take over Middle East policy. He had been hanging out there for months, and then they finally pulled him. So there's a total vacuum in the State Department. I think Secretary Rubio is pretty hawkish, but he's basically overseeing this war in Venezuela now. So I think there's basically a fracturing of policymaking, and there's so many other things going on in the world. I think Trump is still in this view like, I won the 12-day war, I'm going to look elsewhere. I think what's going to be interesting in the next few months is he's moving pretty quickly into being a lame duck. The Republicans got a pretty bad beating this week in the local elections, and if that trend continues into the midterms, he's basically they're on the real back foot. I mean, I guess with Trump, it's kind of interesting. He's going to be a lame duck, so maybe he'll do whatever he wants. And does that mean he will sort of take a more robust stance towards Iran in the last 2.5 years because he just doesn't care?
Interesting point. I didn't think about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, or does he, like we've been talking about, there is a very isolationist wing. The man most likely seen as succeeding Trump, J.D. Vance, really seems to be turning into that kind of part of the MAGA. So if that kind of takes power essentially in the last couple of years, I don't see any more really aggressive military operations against the Islamic Republic. And without that power, I don't see as the Iranians study us, they study our politics probably more than we study it ourselves. They're going to understand where this is headed, and they're not going to be inclined to make any more great concessions, in my estimation.
If I may, Negar, look, very, very quickly, it doesn't really matter what Trump administration does or does not. I'll get to that in a minute. But fundamentally, I think the Islamic Republic as a political system and the country of Iran are in a very bad place, thanks to the policies of the Islamic Republic. So that, we shouldn't think because there isn't an amazing achievement by the Trump administration vis-a-vis Iran that somehow Iran is doing well. It's not. Iran is barely making it in terms of its daily needs as a country. And by the way, falling daily behind everybody else in the Middle East in terms of the future of its economy and all the rest of it. So they're not in a good place. They might not get.
And you specialize in all the Arab countries right now. You're focusing on
right.
that
So
for your next
look at
novel,
that.
Right?
Look at Turkey. Look at all these countries in Iran's neighborhood. They are doing so much more in terms of planning for the future than the Islamic Republic that's literally stuck. But in terms of back to Shahram's point about why hasn't the Trump administration had a breakthrough? I mean, you could look at it in terms of two things. One is about capacity. I mean, the United States can do so much at one point, a given time. So right now, we got all sorts of issues. Venezuela was mentioned, what's going on in Gaza and whether that ceasefire will hold. That's another major issue. The tariff wars, the Russian situation, Ukraine, China, I mean, you name it. So there's one is the issue of capacity that is real. And this is an administration that has probably done more than anybody else I can remember in terms of firing professionals in State Department elsewhere. So where are the teams that are supposed to do the great thinking? That's a real question mark. Number two is a more fundamental issue of intellectual sort of willingness to want to go there. I mean, where does Iran fit in the intellectual thinking of President Trump if he does have a holistic worldview in terms of what sort of world he wants to see? Where does Iran fit into that? But the problem is that he doesn't necessarily see the world in that holistic kind of holistically. He doesn't look at it in terms of that's where I want Iran to fit into the puzzle. So it becomes one of transactional relations. Like, what can Iran do for me in return for me easing sanctions or not bombing him and so forth? And it's not limited to Iran. It's a fundamental way of the president and his team looking at the world from what I can see. And again, in that circumstance, the goalpost keeps moving. So when we talk about breakthrough against what? What are we measuring against? What if Iran tomorrow decided to come with a counter proposal to the Trump administration that will suddenly make them into the darlings of this Trump administration? I mean, it's not beyond. I know what I just said about Ali Khamenei. He's very anti-American and has been throughout. But what I'm saying is, if you don't have a clear-eyed or a clear-cut vision in terms of what the future ought to look like as far as U.S.-Iran relations are concerned, then you kind of become beholden to the actions of the other party to a great extent as well. And that's essentially where we are. On top of that, as everybody said, you got an American public opinion that really has had enough with the Middle East. They don't want America to think big in terms of the Middle East. They want America to think big in terms of inflation and reforming the economy here and dealing with the impact of AI and all the rest of it.
So then, Alex, where does that leave the United States and Iran. So you've got, like you said, Khamenei, his fiery speech where he was praising the hostage crisis of 1979, very anti-American, and said that he won't make any concessions if the U.S. continues to support Israel. But then you mentioned that you've got a regime that is basically holding on to pretty much nothing and is failing and is barely surviving, especially compared to the other Middle Eastern countries. You've got the U.S. and these MAGAs that you mentioned that don't want to have involvement in the Middle East. So what kind of recipe does this create then?
Well, then basically, I think we are at that point right now. So you have the Iranians increasingly saying, our enrichment, the 400 or so kilograms of enriched uranium is under the rubble. There's nothing to see here. Please don't put any more pressure on us. And, talking about maybe reviving something like a new nuclear set of negotiations. In other words, what I'm saying, Negar, is they don't have a plan. They're just going to take day by day. Maybe, this is kind of almost horrendous scenario to think about. Maybe the best Iran can think of is to wait Trump out for 3 more years and thinking that the next American president might be different. Where in fact the problem isn't who's in the White House, it's Iran and the Islamic Republic's approach to the entire question of the United States going back to 1979. This fight that they chose when they took that embassy in November of 1979, they're still dealing with the consequences. They don't want to have a reckoning. They don't want to come out and admit that was a mistake. They don't want to come out and say it's a mistake to just be a single customer when it comes to who buys Iran's oil, which is China. 90% of Iran's oil goes to. There are a lot of ways you can look at it, but fundamentally, this problem can only be solved if whoever's in power, and right now it's Ali Khamenei, makes the decision that where we are right now vis-a-vis the United States and all the fantasy about the declining America and Russia and China are going to save us, that's just a pipe dream. We need to deal with America as it is today. Khamenei's not going to do it. The big question, Negar, is folks around this 86-year-old supreme leader, are they starting to think about if the regime survives, which is a big if, maybe they should, after Khamenei, really take a major decision in terms of relations with Washington, regardless, again, as I said, whether it's Trump or whoever else in the White House?
I would assume yes. What do you think, Shahram? And what does Khamenei's speech say about the mood inside the regime itself and potential factions?
Well, as someone who has worked on politics of memory in the Islamic Republic, I can testify to the fact that for the past 30 years, Khamenei has built his leadership character around, as Alex mentioned, around anti-Americanism. At least twice a year or thrice a year, he basically lambasts the United States, dehumanizes the United States as a whole. And he doesn't even bother to distinguish between American people or the American government. He sees it as a whole. He sees it as an evil whole, that his mission is to stand up to it. This inherent intransigence has been because of the fact that he never became someone like Khomeini. So he had to build himself up to look like Khomeini in the eyes of his followers, basically the people that he uses for the proxy forces outside Iran.
He was never a seasoned Islamic scholar by any means.
That is right. So at the time that the odds of collapse of the regime are gravely close, the chances of salvation of this regime are extremely slim, and the margins of error are infinite. Khamenei is doing something that a traditional, I would say, or a commonplace gambling addict would do. That the more he loses, the higher the stakes that he's bringing to the table. So by maximizing risk, he's trying to maximize benefits, while actually he is reaching the threshold of collapse as a result of this in every possible respect. I remember a year ago, 3 of the strategists close to Khamenei's household, office, Beit Khamenei, from Imam Ali University, from Imam Hussein University, they published an article in which they talked about how Iran has actually made itself useful for China and Russia by becoming a distraction through helping Hamas and Hezbollah and bugging down Israel in this conflict by having become a distraction for the Biden administration. But if we look at it from the last year of the Biden administration to the first 6 months of Trump administration, Netanyahu went full throat to destroy all the tentacles of the Iranian proxy octopus, and 3 times at least attacked Iran vehemently and publicly. The Islamic Republic actually, Jay mentioned that President Trump may become a lame duck. The Islamic Republic itself has been a lame duck and has been trying to save itself from itself. Now, Iraq may become, in a very odd way, in such desperate times for the Islamic Republic, the Achilles heel of the Trump administration. And I do not know how those of us who are, like Jay and Alex, who are close to the Washington Beltway, or they are right in there, can somehow innovatively reach out to the administration and hyper alert them about this threat. Because if Iraq becomes that Achilles heel, then that can actually collapse whatever Trump has built since his first administration in terms of Abraham Accords, in terms of the recent Sharm el-Sheikh Accord, exactly the blind spot that nobody is thinking of or looking at, despite all the advances and developments that we see in Lebanon to the contrary against Hezbollah.
And that's fascinating because in many ways, and Jay, you touched on this in your novel, The Iran Wars, that was also the kind of way of thinking during the Iraq invasion during the George Bush administration, right? So in many ways, they weren't considering the ramifications of what removing Saddam Hussein from power would do to Iran. So it's kind of like what Dr. Kholdi is talking about right now. Do you feel that we're replaying this again, and Iraq is once again the Achilles heel of the United States?
Well, in the invasion of Iraq, they didn't not think of what the ramifications. They misunderstood them. They had some theory that a secular Iraq would kind of blow back into Iran and sort of topple the regime, which obviously...
Or that the different Shias, Arab and Iranian Shias, would somehow not get along. Yeah,
Najaf versus Qom, they had this whole theory, which obviously didn't bore out. So yeah, our miscalculations in Iraq could certainly have big ramifications for Iran, and I'm sure the Iranians are trying to use that, and I'm sure if they see this sort of policy vacuum in Washington, they think they can outsmart us again.
And Alex, that leads me then to the nuclear issue here. We've got the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA's director, Rafael Grossi, warning that visibility has been lost in Iran. How does everything that we've discussed today, how does that relate to the status of Iran's nuclear file?
Look, obviously, IAEA wants to come back in. As we all know, the Iranian side is very upset. They personally hold Grossi responsible because they feel that he played a role in the whole, attack back in June on Iran. So, but look, put all that aside, and I don't want to, focus too much on Grossi. Here's the problem: Iran has spent, who knows, hundreds of billions of dollars, of probably more. Maybe we're talking in the trillions in terms of both direct and indirect cost of this nuclear program, going back to about a quarter of a century. Are they going to stay the course? Are they just going to keep spending whatever $50-60 million of oil income they have each year from China on preserving as much of this nuclear program, just for the sake of it, just as a principle, as they like to say, the sovereign right of a nation? Again, we can get into the whole philosophy or the debate about sovereign right of nations versus the basic needs of the citizens of that nation. So we all know, those of us, all of us here on this call, the situation in Iran in terms of the state of the economy. So you have a nuclear program that has come at this expense, whereas others in the neighborhood are showing you how you can do it. You can do it the Turkish way, the UAE way, or the Pakistani way. There are different ways of going about having a nuclear program depending on your end agenda. But fundamentally, this Iranian approach to having a nuclear program as of today has been nothing but a major a drain for Iran, has resulted in all the wrong things for the country's economy. It's isolated. Now, I know the Islamic Republic's talking points are of one of being independent and being able to stand up and hold their heads high because they can claim to stand up to the United States. But the reality speaks of another truth, which is that Iran is beholden to the likes of Russia and China for its survival. It's strategically isolated. It doesn't really have any friends in the neighborhood. It knows that. And all these latest sort of Arab countries talking nice to Iran is not because they want to be nice to this Islamic Republic. It's because they want to stay out of a potential upcoming war involving Iran and Israel and the United States. So, answering your question, Negar, this way, this nuclear issue needed to be resolved a long time ago. The whole approach, the way the Islamic Republic has gone about it for 25 years has been a mistaken approach, I think. And I'm listening to officials, and I'm not seeing anybody sort of saying, you were wrong, let's try a different approach. And that's the real fundamental problem here.
What do you think about that, Shahram? And could it be used potentially as leverage, or are those days gone now, given the state of Iran?
You took it from the horse's mouth, even though I'm not as smart as a horse. But leverage was the word I was thinking of, because you see, Khamenei and the remainder of the IRGC top brass are deluding themselves that because the 12-day war did not kill them, they are now stronger. That is the greater illusion under which they are operating right now. And upon this self-destructive governing principle, they are now trying to think that Iraq is still a leverage. Hopefully, Houthis are still a leverage. And then they have to double down for the nuclear thing. And my concern, my fear, is that you would see in a year that President Trump has won the Nobel Peace Prize and Grossi has become the General Secretary of the United Nations. And the Islamic Republic issue is still dragging through all the problems of the Middle East and the rest of the world. And who knows, maybe Ukraine and Russia have come to some sort of a peace or ceasefire, but still this Iran-Israel thing is still languishing through. And we would be back here with you talking about it. Who knows?
Yeah. And, a lot of Israeli officials that I've spoken to have said that in many ways, the Islamic Republic feels that they didn't lose this war. They're still in power. They were still able to inflict pretty significant damage in Israel, and that if they come out feeling that they are the winners, this is another recipe for the disaster and more war, in fact. So I just wanted to have some concluding thoughts from everyone. I'll go around. Jay, I'll start with you. We've got some very horrific news of transnational repression inside Iran, where a dissident, Omid Sarlak, a young man who filmed himself burning Khamenei's photo, was killed. The U.S. State Department calls it under suspicious circumstances. What are your reaction to that, and what are the things that you're looking out for in the next days and coming weeks when it comes to Iran? And Jay, we'll start with you, then Alex will end with you, Shahram.
I think we knew there was going to be a pretty harsh crackdown after the 12-day war, so it kind of fits into that framework of what happened. I remember it was on Iran International where they interviewed people inside of Iran asking an Israeli diplomat why they didn't finish off the regime, because they were going to bear the brunt of the repression. So it fits into that, and I think it's sad because that crackdown will continue. I mean, one thing I'm still looking at really closely as far as the regional kind of battle between the U.S. and the axis of resistance, or what remains still, is Gaza. It's pretty interesting to see what's happening in the last couple of weeks, where you have some Hamas officials kind of saying, well, we should keep our arms because we need to enforce the truce. And I could see Qatar and Turkey sort of backing them on it. And I just do not know if the Trump administration, they seem to have almost outsourced their policy towards the Qataris and the Turks in ways that could be quite good for the Islamic Republic if Hamas is able to survive in some way. So kind of in the fallout from this whole era of this last two years of war in Gaza and the 12-day war, are some of these tentacles of the regime going to be able to survive either because of U.S. kind of negligence, so they lose fact, or just others in the in the region sort of are taking charge in ways that might actually be good for Iran in the longer run.
Alex, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, look, I just very briefly, the Islamic Republic, going back to the way it was born, essentially back in 79, repression, violence, it's my way or the highway. That's the style. That's the approach of the Islamic Republic. You know, there was a brief moment right after the 12-day war where, you know, for brief few days, maybe a couple of weeks, we had this sense that maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe Ali Khamenei is going to come back up from deep underground where he was hiding and say, you know what, the whole axis of resistance, everything we've done here hasn't really delivered results. I mean, you know, there was a moment where it wasn't just U.S. that was protecting Israel. It was a lot of other countries in the region that were protecting Israel from Iran's missiles. It was just like, to me, it was just the best example you could point to and say, Iran, you're isolated. The Arab countries, by and large, are protecting Israel against your missiles. And yet here you are worried about what average youth in Iran are doing in terms of their hairstyle and the way they want to live their lives. In other words, you're repressing your own people while you're promising you're going to go and free the Palestinians over there 1,000 miles away. And by the way, you didn't achieve that either, because it has proven beyond any shadow of the doubt that there is no military solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's a political one. And Iran had a moment.
And they know it themselves. I spoke to 2 Palestinians just last week on Eye for Iran. They said not one hospital has been built by Iran.
Right. So Iran could have had a moment where we say, you know what, why don't we join, not Abraham Accords, but at least let's go politically with the rest of the region that wants to look for a political solution to this. They haven't. They didn't even show up in Sharm el-Sheikh because the optics were wrong, because they're so proud of what they have achieved in their own mind as revolutionaries since 1979. Look, this is an extremely stubborn regime. This is a regime, and that stubbornness, by the way, I would put at the feet of Ali Khamenei himself, the supreme leader. He is not a man who turns easily. Even when he sees, the writing is on the wall, he has a very tough time to admit mistakes, to say it's time for us to change course. That is not his personality, and that is shown throughout the regime. So you have a regime that had an opportunity as recently as this summer to change course, to listen to its own people, to look for the basic needs of its own people, which, by the way, quickest way to fixing the economy and dealing with some of the issues that Iranians are having to wrestle with is to change foreign policy, because it's not just a nuclear issue. We have to remember, sanctions on Iran have been imposed going back to the early 1980s. The revolution nature of the regime is the problem, and that's why it's so hard for them to change course, because they really think once they start that reform process, it's a slippery slope and it won't end till the whole thing collapses. Again, Khamenei would be the first one to point out, look to what happened to the Soviet Union. Once Gorbachev started a reform, the whole thing collapsed, and that's what they fear. And that's why they know they're wrong. They know they don't have the people of Iran behind them anymore. And yet they're just taking day by day and going forward, and I guess hoping for some kind of a miracle. And I doubt that miracle is ever going to come.
Shahram, let's conclude with you, please.
Sure. Let me harken back to history again. When the Islamic Republic survived the failed Tabas intervention by President Carter, and then negotiated the release of the American diplomats that they had taken hostage. And then they survived, even though they had lost in the battlefield, the Iran-Iraq war, and they would not have taken back many things had Saddam Hussein not committed the mistake of attacking Kuwait. You see, in those years, in the mid-1990s, I was a research assistant in the Planning and Budget Organization because one of my professors was working as an advisor with them. And then I served in the regular Army's Air Force. And I remember the regime, everybody would hear this, that the top officials think that they were walking on the knife's edge. But what happened? Between 1988 to the mid-1990s, the regime committed massive atrocities against prisoners. They killed them in the thousands. They committed assassination abroad operations and killed a lot of opposition leaders, including the late Prime Minister Bakhtiar, the last Prime Minister of the Shah. And they continued on, doubled down on the missile program and engaged in the nuclear program. This is a regime that thinks that every failure that it has committed, because it has not killed it, it has made it stronger. And if it were not because of the surge in the oil prices in the late 1990s, they would not have developed the prowess to have the money to commit the adventures that they committed. If it were not because of the manner by which the Bush administration toppled Saddam Hussein, they would not have developed the kind of proxy networks that they developed. So they are thinking that they are going to get away with murder again in the aftermath of the 12-day war. And they don't care. They think that they are going to survive it. They are going to come out unscathed. And let's hope that is not the case. But my fear is that, as Jay mentioned, as Alex mentioned, if the Trump administration continues to delegate its major foreign policy strategy to countries like Qatar and Turkey, it would have again committed in a different way what all the U.S. administrations since President Carter towards Iran have made that mistake. And that mistake is this: they have mistaken tactical deterrence against the Islamic Republic as a strategic policy. They are just acting short term. It is high time that Trump administration completely turned this flawed cycle on its head and became proactive. I do not know how they can do this. I do not know how they can co-opt China and Russia to come or decouple them from each other in order to deal a final blow to the Islamic Republic. But it is impossible. And if I may, I think people like Alex and Jay have to find a way to cater to the Trump administration, to listen to them. Because when I was in DC 6 weeks ago, it was quite clear that none of these think tanks, nobody listens to them in the Pentagon, in the West Wing, in the State Department. And this is, in my opinion, extremely dangerous for the United States and, if I may, for the legacy of President Trump, if he would hear my words.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. It was a pleasure and an honor to have everybody on Eye for Iran today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Negar.
Thank you.
You can sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top analysis, key stories, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, you can head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.